Take a moment to consider this. You most likely have a single piece of paper proving your existence right now, resting in a filing cabinet or drawer someplace in your home. Your certificate of birth. You cannot obtain a passport, a driver's license, a social security number, enroll in school, open a bank account, get married, or even demonstrate that you were a citizen of the nation where you were born without it. The foundation of your entire legal identity is just one document. It is the first official link that connects your name to a period, location, and country. Now, here is where things get unsettling. For the first 126 years of America's existence, that document did not exist. There was no federal system for recording births. There was no standardized form. There was no government office keeping track of who was born, where, or when. From 1776 all the way through the end of the 19th century, the United States of America, the most ambitious democratic experiment in human history, had no reliable way of knowing whether you were even real.
If you were born on a farm in rural Ohio in 1860, or in a tenement in Lower Manhattan in 1880, the government had no official record of your arrival on this earth. You were just there, a person who existed because the people around you said so. So how did the government know you existed? How did it tax you, draft you into war, or decide whether you could vote? The answer is a fascinating and deeply strange patchwork of church ledgers, family Bibles, local gossip, handshake agreements, and sworn testimony from your neighbors. Furthermore, the tale of how America eventually came up with the birth certificate is more than just a dry bureaucratic footnote. Power, who is counted and who is erased, child labor, immigration, world wars, and the arduous process of building the modern state are all topics covered in this tale. It shows in America that the majority of people have totally forgotten. A nation where your identity was a narrative shared by those who knew you, rather than a record in a database. Let us start at the beginning, because in order to comprehend why America lacked birth certificates, you must first understand the type of nation that existed when the first European settlers arrived on the eastern seaboard and brought their record-keeping customs with them. However, those customs were religious rather than political.
Since the 1500s, parish priests in England have maintained birth, marriage, and death registers. The church kept these records for its own purposes, keeping account of who had been baptized, who had received sacraments, and who was married in God's eyes, rather than because the state required them. When English settlers arrived in Virginia and Massachusetts, they carried the same habit. The local minister or town clerk would jot down christenings and burials in a leather-bound ledger, and that was about as official as it got. Now, the colonies did make some early attempts at civil registration. Virginia's General Assembly passed a law in 1632 requiring all ministers to keep track of christenings, marriages, and burials. Massachusetts followed in 1639 with a law requiring towns to record births, marriages, and deaths. These were genuine efforts. The colonial governments recognized, at least in principle, that knowing who lived in their territory was important. But here's the problem. Almost nobody followed through. The Virginia law died almost immediately because the practice was so unfamiliar to church officials that they simply ignored it. In Massachusetts, records were kept, but they were patchy, inconsistent, and full of gaps.
For a few years, a town clerk may keep track of births before stopping. It is possible for a new minister to take over and begin a new ledger that is unrelated to the previous one. Records were destroyed by floods, fires, and the usual mayhem of frontier life. Therefore, your birth was a family affair, rather than a government event for the great majority of colonial Americans, and the Americans who followed them through the Revolution, the early Republic, the Civil War, and the Gilded Age. The family Bible was the most popular source for birth records. You're familiar with those bulky, weighty Bibles that have gilt pages and a blank space at the front where family milestones can be noted? That was not ornamentation. Your identity document was that. Your name and birth date would be put on that page by your mother, father, or possibly a grandfather. This entry, scribbled in fading ink over the years, was the closest thing you had to proving you were born at all.
There were baptismal records, in addition to the family Bible. The minister would note the date of your baptism if your family was a church member, as the majority of families were. However, baptism and birth were not the same thing. A child may be baptized days, weeks, or even months after birth, and the date of the ceremony, rather than the date of the child's actual birth, is usually included in the baptismal record. Therefore, even if there was a church record, it was frequently an estimate. And then there was simply the testimony of the people who knew you. If someone needed to verify your age or your identity, they did not pull out a certificate. They asked your neighbors. They asked the midwife who delivered you. They asked the people at church, the shopkeeper down the road, the fellow who ran the local mill. In a world of small towns and tight-knit communities, everyone knew everyone. Your identity was not a piece of paper. It was a web of human relationships. You were the son of so-and-so, the daughter of the family on the hill, the boy who was born the same winter the river froze over. People placed you in time not by looking at a document, but by remembering the events that surrounded your birth. This might sound quaint and charming, but it was also deeply unreliable, and it created enormous problems as the country began to grow.
Because here's the thing about America in the 19th century. It was not sitting still. It was expanding westward at a breathtaking pace. Families packed their belongings into wagons and disappeared over the Appalachians, into the Ohio Valley, across the Great Plains, and beyond. When you moved 1,000 miles from the town where you were born, the web of human relationships that had defined your identity snapped. Nobody in your new community had been at your christening. Your parents were unknown. No one could attest to your age. In some ways, it was liberating to start over, but it also meant that your past could not be verified. Furthermore, this was not a personal issue. For the government, it was an issue. Article 1, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution required that a population count be conducted every 10 years. This was not a choice. Because representation in Congress was based on population, the census was incorporated into the republic's very structure. You could not manage the government if you did not count the people. 1 year following the ratification of the Constitution, in 1790, the first census was conducted. It was an enormous undertaking.
In addition to the districts of Kentucky, Maine, and Vermont, as well as the Southwest Territory that would eventually become Tennessee, 650 federal marshals and their aides dispersed throughout the original 13 states. They went door to door and counted heads while traveling on foot and horseback. By today's standards, the census form was rather straightforward. The household head's name, the number of free white males 16 years of age and older, the number of free white males under 16, the number of free white females, the number of all other free persons, and the number of enslaved people were the only 6 things it requested. That was all. There were no birthplaces, dates, or ages for anyone other than the general classification of above or below. The country was vast, the infrastructure was terrible, and many people, especially those living on the frontier or in remote areas, were simply missed. The census was a blunt instrument. It could tell you roughly how many people lived in a given area, but it could not tell you who they were, when they were born, or whether they were even the same people who had been counted 10 years before. And so, for over a century, the United States operated in a kind of demographic fog. The government knew approximately how many people it had, but it did not know with any precision who those people were. There was no master list of citizens. There was no way to definitively prove when or where you had been born. And for most of American history, nobody cared. The government did not need to know your exact birthday to collect your taxes. It did not need a birth certificate to draft you into the army. It just needed warm bodies. If you looked old enough to fight, you fought. If you owned property, you paid. The system was rough,
informal and deeply personal. It relied on trust, reputation, and the word of the community. But all of that started to change as the 19th century wore on. And it changed because of forces that were far larger than any single individual. The first force was immigration. Between 1815 and 1915, roughly 30 million Europeans crossed the Atlantic and poured into the United States. One of the biggest mass migrations in human history. It completely changed the nation. Newcomers who spoke various languages, followed different religions, and had no connection to the pre-existing community networks that had functioned as unofficial identification systems, flooded cities like New York, Boston, Chicago, and Philadelphia.
The conventional methods of identifying people were no longer effective in this new urban environment. If a worker had recently arrived from a village in Sicily or a shtetl in Poland, a manufacturing foreman in New York could not inquire the local priest about the worker's family history. An identity crisis, in the truest sense, was brought about by the vast number of persons who were strangers to both the government and each other. People whose names, ages, and origins were almost unknown were swarming the cities. Reformers from the Progressive Era, many of whom were wealthy women, believed that this was a catastrophe that required attention. They started gathering information compulsively, mapping the whereabouts of various ethnic groups, numbering the unemployed, and recording filthy living conditions and overcrowded tenements.
They were motivated by a sincere desire to enhance social welfare and public health, but they were also extremely concerned about the influx of strangers into their cities. They also ran into a hurdle when it came to public health. The most basic information regarding births and deaths was absent. Without knowing how many babies were being born or how many of them were dying, they could not measure infant mortality, they could not track the spread of disease, and they could not make the case for the reforms they were pushing. They needed birth data, and the country simply did not have it. The second force was child labor, and this is where the story takes a darker and more urgent turn. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, America ran on child labor. Factories, mines, mills, and farms employed children in staggering numbers. In 1900, the number of children between the ages of 10 and 14 who worked for wages was 1.75 million. Many states permitted children to work up to 10 hours per day and 60 hours per week prior to the 1890s. These were not youngsters working after school. These young youngsters, ages 8, 9, and 10, were running hazardous machinery, crawling down coal mine holes that were too tiny for adults, and standing upright for whole shifts in textile mills. Reformers started vigorously advocating for legislation that would establish minimum age limits for employment, especially those connected to the National Child Labor Committee, which was established in 1904. The reasoning was straightforward. When a child was required to be 14 years old in order to work in a factory, there was no trustworthy method for proving the youngster's age.
Which is where everything broke down. Parental affidavits were the foundation of the system at the time. It was meant to be sufficient for a parent to sign a sworn, notarized statement stating their child's age. However, parents often told falsehoods. Working-class families relied on each member making a financial contribution, and many parents were prepared to lie if claiming their 12-year-old was 14 meant the difference between eating and going hungry. And it was not just the parents. The notaries who were supposed to verify these affidavits often looked the other way. Factory inspectors complained endlessly about the problem. In Wisconsin, for example, the state's factory inspector reported that the lack of reliable or complete birth records made enforcement nearly impossible. He noted cases where parents had even altered the dates recorded in their family Bibles to make their children appear older.
Historian Susan Pearson, who has written extensively about this period, captured the absurdity of the situation perfectly. She noted that many adults in this era did not even know their own exact birth date. When asked to verify their age at the polling place, Few 19th century Americans could do so with any precision. Many people were unable to provide their age or birth date in the 1900 census. In the modern sense, age was not a hard fact. It was a ballpark estimate that changed based on who asked and why. Thus, the reformers came to an important realization. Increasing the number of inspectors or putting more trust in parents was not the answer to enforcing child labor regulations. Making a document that existed independently of the parties involved was the answer. A document created by a professional at the time of birth, stamped and filed by a government agency, and retrievable years later when a child's age needed to be established. The birth certificate was the answer. Ironically, as Pearson notes, the drive for
a child's age and identity were transformed into what Pearson refers to as an objective fact, a reality that existed independently of the interpersonal ties that gave rise to the child by a professionally made birth certificate. New York took the lead. In 1903, the state passed a labor law that gave first preference to the birth certificate as proof of age. If no birth certificate was available, inspectors could accept a baptismal certificate, a Bible record, immigration documents, a passport, or even a life insurance policy. Parental affidavits were at the very bottom of the list, accepted only in conjunction with a physical examination by a physician who would certify the child's estimated age by looking at their physical development. Reformers then used New York's law as a template and pushed it state by state across the country. But getting states to require birth certificates was one thing. Actually recording births was another matter entirely. Finally, the federal government comes into play at this point. The Bureau of the Census was made a permanent government entity by an act passed by Congress in 1902.
Prior to this, the census was a one-time event that took place every 10 years before being discontinued. The establishment of a permanent bureau gave the government the administrative framework it needed to create a nationwide birth registration system, something it had never done previously. The first United States Standard Certificate of Live Birth was developed by the Census Bureau in 1907. States could use this template to make sure their records matched the national system. Here's the catch, though. The federal government was free to make any number of proposals. In reality, it could not compel any state to comply. Washington was not authorized by the Constitution to require the registration of vital records. Many states were not in a rush, and that was a state issue. The birth registration area, a collection of states that complied with specific minimum requirements for documenting births, was established by the Census Bureau. Only 10 states and the District of Columbia were eligible when the birth registration region was first created in 1915.
In terms of record keeping, the remainder of the nation was practically still in the Dark Ages. The states that dragged their feet were predictably the more rural and less industrialized ones. If you were born on a farm in Texas, South Carolina, or Georgia in the early 1900s, the odds of your birth being officially recorded were slim. There was no hospital, there was no doctor. A midwife delivered you in a back bedroom, and your mother or father might or might not have gotten around to telling the county clerk. Rural areas were especially inconsistent. A baby born on a ranch in 1880s Montana or in the hill country of 1890s Kentucky might have absolutely no official record of their birth beyond a fading entry in a family Bible, if even that. It took until 1933 for all 48 states to finally join the birth registration area. Think about that. It was not until 1933 that the U.S. attained universal birth registration. 157 years have passed since the Declaration of Independence. The Eiffel Tower was constructed 44 years ago. Charles Lindbergh completed his transatlantic flight 6 years ago. The nation that was developing skyscrapers, powering entire cities, and inventing aircraft had yet to come up with a simple method for keeping track of births. Furthermore, the system was far from ideal even after 1933. Early birth certificates were simple records. Only a brief description of the child's identity and parents was recorded.
Additionally, a significant portion of people delivered at home were overlooked by the system because hospital deliveries were still rare. There were only 33 items on the original federal birth certificate template in 1900. A properly standardized version would not be widely used until the 1930s, and checkboxes intended to enhance data completeness and quality would not be included to the format until 1989.
With nearly 60 items of information, the modern birth certificate is the result of more than a century of bureaucratic development. However, neither a law nor a reform movement was the true turning point that made the birth certificate important to regular Americans. It was cash. The Social Security Act was signed into law by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1935. One of the most significant pieces of legislation in American history, it established a federal safety net that would offer unemployment insurance, retirement benefits. But to qualify for Social Security benefits, you had to prove your age. You had to demonstrate that you were 65 years old and eligible for retirement payments. And the simplest way to do that was to produce a birth certificate. Suddenly, a government-verified birth record was not just a statistical abstraction or tool for child labor enforcement. It was a financial necessity. Millions of Americans who had been born in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, people who had lived their entire lives without anyone asking for documentary proof of their birth, now needed a piece of paper they had never possessed.
The demand for what became known as delayed birth certificates surged. These were documents issued retroactively, sometimes decades after the actual birth, based on whatever secondary evidence could be scraped together. Census records, old church ledgers, family Bible entries, or sworn affidavits from elderly relatives who could testify that, yes, they remembered when so-and-so was born. The delayed birth certificate is one of those quiet, forgotten artifacts of American history that tells you more about the country than any textbook. Imagine being 65 years old in 1936, having worked your entire life, and being informed that you needed a document that had never existed in order to receive the retirement benefits you were promised. You would need to go to a government agency, find proof that you were born where and when you claimed to be, have someone sign a statement under oath, and then hope the bureaucracy would accept it.
This was a significant obstacle for many Americans, particularly those who lived in rural areas, were poor, Black, or immigrants. From the start, the system that was meant to capture everyone was engineered to overlook some individuals. The war then broke out. The birth certificate changed from being a financial document to a national security document when the United States entered World War II. Ammunition companies and defense plants were employing at a never-before-seen rate, but they were legally limited to hiring only Americans. You had to show your citizenship in order to be hired to build the ships, aircraft, and weaponry that would win the war. Additionally, presenting a birth certificate was the main method of proving your citizenship. This was an enormous challenge. Approximately 43 million Americans, or roughly 1/3 of the working population, requested a verified copy of their birth certificate from their states between 1940 and 1945. 43 million. That is not a bureaucratic footnote. That is a national crisis of identity, a moment when 1/3 of the country had to scramble to prove they were who they said they were. The stories from this period are revealing and sometimes heartbreaking.
One man from Rhode Island wrote to the authorities saying that it was America and it was not right to refuse him a job because he did not have his birth papers, that he had a wife and child and he wanted to work. A woman named Grace Wilson, 42 years old from Kansas, hoped to get a job in the aircraft industry, but could not even enroll in the training school. She expressed how bitter it felt to know she was an American citizen whose grandparents and parents had also been American, and still not be able to establish her citizenship. These were not edge cases. These were millions of ordinary Americans, born and raised in the country, who had no way to prove it on paper. Under the weight of a contemporary, industrial, mobile society, the system that had depended on communal knowledge, that is, on individuals knowing one another and being able to vouch for one another, had finally and totally collapsed. A world war could not be fought with the honor system. The administration was ultimately compelled to take matters seriously by the wartime crisis. The Office of Vital Statistics was tasked with supervising birth certificate requirements in 1946 as part of a larger effort to enhance national health programs and the welfare state. Although the states would still be in charge of maintaining the actual records, a federal agency would now tasked with making sure the system functioned as intended.
I want to take a moment now to explore who was left out of this story, which is something that is not often acknowledged. Because bureaucratic modernity is not the only aspect of the American birth certificate's history, it is a tale of exclusion as well. The communities that were already marginalized had the highest likelihood of having their births go unregistered. Black Americans were often underregistered, especially in the rural South. There was no hospital, no doctor, and no county clerk in 1905 if you were born on a sharecropper's farm in Mississippi. You were delivered by a midwife, and it is possible that no one in an official capacity was informed about your delivery. When the Social Security Act came along 30 years later and demanded proof of birth, these were the Americans who had the hardest time producing it. Native Americans faced similar challenges. Many were born on reservations with minimal government infrastructure, and their births were often recorded, if at all, by tribal or mission records that did not interface with state vital statistics systems. Immigrants who arrived as children, whose births had been recorded in distant countries or not at all, were also caught in the gap.
The birth certificate, which was supposed to be a universal guarantee of identity and citizenship, was in practice a document that tracked most precisely the people the government already cared about: white, native-born, urban Americans with access to hospitals and physicians. This discrepancy has actual repercussions. You might not be eligible for Social Security benefits if you could not prove your age. You might not be hired if you could not verify your citizenship. You might be refused a passport, a driver's license, or admission to a public school if you could not provide a birth certificate. You did not cease to exist because there was no documentation. It indicated that the state was unaware of your existence, which might be disastrous in today's bureaucratic culture. This is what truly puts everything in perspective. The notion that your identity should be defined by a document and that you do not truly exist until a piece of paper is stamped by a government institution is incredibly new. Identity was relational for the majority of human history. You were the person your community claimed you to be. Your name, age, and parentage were all kept up to date by live memory rather than filing cabinets. A significant change in the relationship between the state and the individual is represented by the birth certificate, a change from a society in which identity was communal and personal to one in which identity is documentary and bureaucratic.
And that shift did not happen because someone had a grand philosophical vision. It happened because of a series of very practical crises. Child labor laws needed a way to verify age. Immigration created populations that could not be tracked through traditional community networks. Social Security needed proof of age for benefit eligibility. A world war needed proof of citizenship for defense employment. Each crisis pushed the country a little further toward the system we have today, where a single document issued at the moment of your birth follows you for the rest of your life. There is something both reassuring and unsettling about that. Reassuring because the birth certificate provides a kind of certainty. You were born at this time and this place, to these parents. It anchors you in the world. But unsettling because it also means that your identity is, at its foundation, a government construct. The state decides the format. The state issues the document. The state keeps the records.
In the eyes of the law, you are nothing without that document. Think about how big this is, even now. Approximately 150 million children under the age of 5 have never had their births recognized, according to United Nations estimates.
An additional 55 million people have reportedly been enrolled, but they lack a tangible certificate to support their claim. Without a birth certificate, young kids may be denied access to health care, education, and legal safeguards against child labor and trafficking. The story of the birth certificate is not exclusive to America. It is a worldwide narrative about who is remembered and who is not. Let us now return to America and consider the implications of this. The nation that created modern democracy drafted a constitution requiring a population census and engaged in a civil war over who qualified as a complete human being did not have a working birth registration system until the 20th century. The government used a patchwork of church documents, family Bibles, first-hand accounts, and best guesses for more than a century.
It was a trust-based system that functioned largely in a world of stable villages and small towns. However, when faced with immigration, urbanization, industry, and the necessities of a contemporary state, it totally fell apart. The birth certificate was the result of a number of last-ditch efforts, rather than a big scheme. Reformers needed it to fight child labor. Public health authorities, the War Department needed it to verify citizenship. Each of these institutions pulled the birth certificate into existence for its own purposes, and together they created a document that none of them had originally envisioned, the foundational identity document of the modern American citizen. And there is one more layer to this story that is worth mentioning, because it connects directly to the present. The evolution of the birth certificate did not stop in 1946. It kept evolving, growing more detailed, more standardized, and more important with each passing decade.
By 1972, federal law required the Social Security Administration to obtain evidence of age, citizenship, name, and identity for anyone applying for benefits, further cementing the birth certificate as the cornerstone of the American identity system. By 2003, the normal birth certificate had almost 60 data points, up from 33 in 1900. From being a straightforward record of a child's name and parents, the document evolved into a comprehensive medical and demographic profile that included details about the mother's health, the delivery circumstances, and an increasing number of statistical data. Additionally, the birth certificate grew more disputed as it gained significance. Discussions on who is eligible for one, what information it should include, and how it should be used have turned into intensely political arguments. Their main concerns with birth certificates are those related to citizenship, immigration status, and identity verification. Some of the most contentious debates in American public life currently revolve around the document that did not exist for the first century of American history.
Therefore, consider what your birth certificate, that faded, crumpled, official-looking piece of paper with your name and date on it, means the next time you open that drawer and take it out. It symbolizes a system that was constructed over 150 years ago. It symbolizes the battles of reformers who sought to eradicate child labor, immigrants who established new lives in strange towns, workers who sought a safety net in old age, and a country that rallied for war after learning that 1/3 of its citizens were unable to provide identification. It symbolizes an essential agreement between the people and the government, an agreement that,
if this story changed the way you think about something as simple as a piece of paper, let us know in the comments. We would love to hear which part surprised you the most. If you enjoyed this journey through America's hidden history, hit like, share it with someone who would find it just as fascinating, and subscribe so you never miss the next deep dive. We are already digging into the next story, and trust us, it is just as eye-opening. See you in the next one.